Today's speaker, Vivian Malone Jones, is a distinguished and honored daughter of the capstone, a notable graduate of its College of Commerce and Business Administration, and a signal figure of courage and grace in the history of this institution. As the first African American to graduate from the University of Alabama, she, with quiet confidence and unshakable resolve, blazed a trail of full citizenship for all Alabamians, regardless of their race. By bravely walking through the schoolhouse door with her fellow student James Hood, she completed the work begun in 1892 when the doors of this university were first opened to women. Each year, the university is pleased to award a scholarship named in honor of Mrs. Jones and endowed by people who admire her valor and integrity. Mrs. Jones retired in 1996 from an illustrious career in government service that culminated in the position of Director of the Office of Environmental Justice of the Environmental Protection Agency. She has used her talents as an entrepreneur in establishing a commercial and residential real estate company in Atlanta and in serving as the president of a medical equipment supply company. Mrs. Jones also has served as the first female CEO of the Voter Education Project, an Atlanta-based nonprofit organization, and is very active in community work within organizations including the Leadership Atlanta Alumni Association and the National Council of Negro Women. Please join me in welcoming Vivian Malone Jones back to the University of Alabama as our Millennium Summer Commencement Speaker. Ms. Jones.
Thank you. To President Sorensen, members of the Board of Trustees, graduates of the new millennium, families and friends. Lord, what a difference 35 years make. For one thing, and I was very pleased to know that the ceremonies would be held indoors and air-conditioned. When I graduated in 1965, we met over in Denny Stadium, that is now the Bryant-Denny Stadium, although the legendary coach would notch his third national championship that fall. And Joe Namath was my quarterback. But you know, the differences between then and now were more striking than just where commencement was being held. 35 years ago, by attending the University of Alabama, I had the privilege of representing all those who fought for simple justice. The simple act of walking through a schoolhouse door that had been barred to me and people of my color by the governor of this state, that simple act represented an end to legal segregation in the American South. On that day, Alabama became the last state in the Union to yield to the force of law and the weight of conscience. Segregation, as it had been known and to be ratified in Plessy versus Ferguson and passed on in the Alabama Constitution of 1901, which, by the way, still governs this state, that form of segregation officially ended on that very hot day in June 1963. But it was more than just a hot day. It was a dangerous day. Although every precaution had been taken by state and federal authorities and by university officials to assure my safety as well as that of James Hood, no one knew for sure just what might happen. The demonstrations in Birmingham, accompanied by fire hoses, police dogs, bombings, and a police riot, had just ended. Later in September of that same year, 4 little girls would die in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. That same year, the President of the United States would be assassinated on November 22nd. And less than 12 hours after I walked into Foster Auditorium to begin my days as a student here, Medgar Evers was shot dead from ambush in nearby Jackson, Mississippi. Under those circumstances, I could not help but be mindful of the sacrifices made by many to make that day possible. The lives and careers of Charles Houston, Thurgood Marshall, who with Constance Baker Motley, Arthur Shores, Fred Gray, and others opened the legal door. The courage of John Lewis, Robert Moses, and all of the children of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who took the blows and kept their eyes on the prize. The lives of Phyllis Wheatley, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Booker T. Washington, and many others, who lit the lamp of freedom that would be tended by Fannie Lou Hamer and all the heroes of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. White Southerners too, those who spoke against the evil of their day at considerable risk. Clifford and Virginia Durr, Judge Frank M. Johnson, Charles Morgan, Carl Elliott, Hugo Black come to mind. Like me, they were University of Alabama graduates, and all played a role in my being at the schoolhouse door on June 11, 1963. But I would be remiss, and indeed wrong, if I did not point to those close at hand, certainly my family. My son and my daughter, my son and his wife, my grandchildren are here today with me. But my family, my parents, who although they are deceased, were there with me, and my brothers and sisters back in that day. And also I remember the people of Tuscaloosa. The community rallied to my side. I could not have done what I did back in those days without Stillman College and the people of Tuscaloosa's West End. They provided my safe haven. And I often think of what they did for Honorary Lucy, the brave and courageous woman who first opened the door of this university in 1956, only to have it slammed in her face by a howling mob that the university did not, and perhaps even could not, stand up to. She fled to safety in that same community that would put its arms around me. Of course, to mention names risk leaving out so many people of equal importance to my well-being. But for reasons that you'll understand, I'll just have to mention just one name. And that person was the Stillman student, Mac Jones. Mac would always come over to the campus to pick me up on various occasions, and it wasn't always pleasant because it could have been a very frightening experience, but he drove over anyway. And I could always see him because he drove a big car, a big DeSoto, and it stood out over all the little cars that most people drove here at the university. Everybody had newer versions. His was quite old. He had one of the two cars on campus at Stillman. And if you haven't figured that out, my last name and his are the same. We would later marry. We have two wonderful children that I mentioned earlier. He finished his medical education at Emory, and we both started our careers. Mac would love to have been here with us today, but last Wednesday, he was very, very blessed to have a kidney transplant and is recovering very well, but unfortunately, he could not make the trip. This is another miracle of the last 35 years. But as glorious and as joyous as this day is, I must confess that my affection for the university did not develop immediately. My 2 years on campus were lonely, despite the self-conscious and understandably awkward efforts on some fellow students to reach out. I also remember fondly and warmly some of the administrators and faculty who just went out of their way to make my stay here easier. I remember Dean Healy as I walked into Mary Burke Hall and was greeted by students there. I remember Dr. Minnie Miles, Professor Miriam Locke, who were loving and caring and constant in their support of me. Still, when I graduated, I could not help but be mindful that only a handful of African American students followed me, and that no business in the state of Alabama recruited me or offered me a job as they did many of my classmates. So I had to leave the state to find a career. But my feelings have changed throughout the years as I have watched the university push forward in the enrollment and graduation of African American students to the point that today it is a national leader among doctoral degree granting institutions. I have admired even more the university's awareness that it is not where it needs and wants to be on the issues that vitally affect the people of this state, especially its African American population. But I have confidence that I could not have had years ago that it will succeed. I have happily and eagerly worked with the Black Faculty and Staff Association, and as Dr. Sorensen had mentioned earlier, I'm very proud to have a scholarship named for me. I'm also very, very proud of the portrait of me that's hanging in Bidgood Hall, but I'm even prouder of Arthurine Luce's portrait that hangs in the Ferguson Center, and that of Arthur Shore's in the library. These and other icons of African American heritage and accomplishment make this a friendlier and a more inspiring campus. If there is any lesson for the graduates to take from my experience, it is that you must always be ready to seize the moment. When I arrived here on June 11, 1963, years of preparation had gone into making this happen. I'd been active in my own community's efforts to end segregation. I'd been inspired by the personal courage of people like John LaFleur, head of the Nonpartisan Voters League in Mobile, formerly the NAACP, and I had applied for admission to the University of Alabama Mobile branch, only to be turned away. I then studied for 2 years at Alabama A&M before answering the call that would lead me to the schoolhouse door at this university, where 2 years later, I would become its first African-American graduate. And I almost graduated in 4 years, something that is very rare today. My point to you this morning is that turning points in personal lives and those of communities come through preparation. I often think of the courage of Rosa Parks. The basic outline of her story is well known, at least as it relates to the Montgomery bus boycott. But this was more than just a tired seamstress, just happening on a given day to give up a seat on a bus. The measure of her courage was that she had prepared for that moment. She was active in the NAACP. She had attended workshops and training sessions. She knew the cost of her courage. She knew the danger involved, but she did it anyway because she was prepared for the moment. It wasn't some accident we celebrate in her life, but a life made ready by quiet determination and preparation. Don't mistake me. Rosa Parks did not know that her day would be December 1, 1955, any more than I knew that mine would be June 11, 1963. But she was ready, and so must you. You may not live in a time of great social change as I did, but you will just as certainly face moral choices. There will come a day in your life when you must act for others, your family, perhaps your community, and you must be ready. What you have done to reach this milestone today is part of that preparation. So take from all the books you have read, all the lessons you have learned, the certain knowledge that one day, any day, you must be bold, have courage, and walk through a door that leads to opportunity for others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for those inspiring words, which were obviously appreciated by the entire audience. At this time, I call upon the provost to present the candidate for an honorary degree.
Dr. Sorensen, it is my pleasure to present to you and to the members of the university community assembled here today, Mrs. Vivian Malone Jones, candidate for the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa. Mrs. Jones, a native of Monroeville, Alabama, is an honored alumna of the University of Alabama. After graduating with the class of 1965, she began a 30-year career in public service in which she worked for justice and progress for all citizens, particularly veterans, minorities, and young people. The grace and conviction that were her hallmark as a university student continue to stamp her life and work with authenticity and value. She is an inspiration and role model, and the University of Alabama is a better place because of the example she sets. I am pleased now to present Mrs. Vivian Malone Jones for the Doctorate of Humane Letters, honoris causa.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees of the University of Alabama, I confer upon you, Vivian Malone Jones, the degree Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa, with all the rights and privileges thereunto appertaining.